Right. So in the last session, we discussed about Spring Framework. We have discussed already. At the same time, we have discussed even about Spring Boot with microservices, all that. Today, I'm going to discuss about Spring Cloud configuration part. Because if we have seen the previous examples as I have taken in the class in the last session, like about Spring Boot, right? So that part I already discussed. In this regard, at the same time, when we are working on the Spring Boot part in context to the cloud environment, because now and then the development of the frameworks and applications development, we are working on the cloud environment. In this regard, so whatever the configuration parameters which are reading by us from the kind of property file packages inside the project, either the application properties or application YAML, all that. The kind of properties, whatever the properties are, we are moving out of the code to a property file. When there is any kind of microservices are moved from one environment to another environment, these properties need to undergo the changes. For that, we require an application rebuild. So when it comes to the 12-factor application principles, which advocates one-time build and moving the binaries across environments. Hence, it's always important for us to understand about the microservices configuration, followed by the kind of parameters are we using for Spring Cloud configuration server, which is always important. In this regard, today it's always important when we are learning Spring Boot and microservices. It's always important for us to know and understand about Spring configuration server, which stores properties in a version controlled repository, such as Git or SV and all that. This Spring Cloud configuration server architecture, as in when you can see, right? So on the screen, as I'm showing you the kind of diagram. So which majorly the kind of preceding diagram, which the configuration clients embedded in the Spring Boot microservices does a configuration lookup from a central configuration server. At the same time, what are the configuration properties maybe in the application related, such as trade limit per day or infrastructure related properties or URL credentials, right? So all that stuff. In this regard, unlike Spring Boot, Spring Cloud uses a bootstrap context, which is a parameter context of the main application. Whatever the kind of bootstrap context is responsible for loading configuration properties from the configuration server. At the same time, the bootstrap context looks for the bootstrap properties or bootstrap.yaml for loading initial configuration properties, all that. Now, in this regard, so when we try to understand and setting up the configuration server, there are different steps which normally we have to follow. So today I'm going to explain you what are the configuration steps we have to follow, right? So there are some steps to configure the server, especially in context to this, as follows, right? So what are the steps and all everything I'm explaining, right? So the first step wherein, for example, when we are creating a new Spring Starter project, wherein we have to select the configure server, followed by the activator. This is the first step which normally we have to do when we are following the Spring Cloud configuration part. Next, we need to download, because these are the steps. Do you remember? These are the steps which you have to be you have to follow when we are working on the Sprint Cloud configuration, because which is essentially important. Of course, on the application front, I'll discuss it later, because these are the steps you can make a note of it in your session, in your uh, class video and all. Uh, you can just write down the steps, whatever the steps I'm explaining you, right? So you can write down the steps here. And the first step is this: creating a new Spring Starter project is what something we have to do. Next, we need to download all the GitHub repositories. Make sure that whatever the properties do we have, right? So for example, the properties are in D, right? So for example, we have these in program files, right? So for example, right? So program files where it will be in the under the GitHub and all, right? So we're in CMD. Add it to path. Which is to create configuration repository folder in Windows. Do remember, write down these points so that the configuration will be much easier for you, right? So when you're working on the application, it will be more easier for you to work on. So please make a note of these points well, right? So when we are working on this, make sure we need to write down all the points, whatever we mentioning over here. It's very important, right? So that's what generally we have to do, right? So folder in Windows is what something which we have to be created in the beginning time. Next, once it will done, now we have to navigate to config repo, wherein we can call upon this from C users. That's example, right? So I'm just mentioning a name, right? So Sandeep -pc /config repo. Wherein informing you need to call upon the git integer, where whatever the echo message for example we have taken, right? So hello world as an example I'm taking, for example, right? So hello world is what something which we have taken, and this application properties where it have, right? So this is the second step which we have to follow. Now when it comes to the second step, when we are downloading all the JIT and all, make sure whatever the kind of code snippet creates a new Git repository on the local file system. The kind of property file named application properties with a message property and value hello world is also created. Everything will be informed in it. Now the third point about change the configuration part. Change the configuration. Now we need to do the changing of configuration in the config server. To use the Git repository. To use the Git repository, which is to create in the previous step, as because if you can see on the previous step, we have mentioned this, right? So in context to the configuration now, this is what something which I have created. So in this previous step, we have to follow the steps and all that. Now, in order to do this, in order to follow and use that, all that, we need to rename the file application dot properties for Bootstrap. Bootstrap dot properties in SRC. SRC, we need to file, we need to locate in SRC main resources resources folder. Next, at the same time, we need to select it SRC main resource. Bootstrap broad properties. Server.port is equal to 9999. Okay, for example, right? So port number we have to provide, right? So whichever the port number we have, that we have to provide here. But when it comes to the port number, which is a default port for the configuration server, even without configuring the servers and all that, generally whatever the configuration server, which must be bounded to 8888 or 9999, right? So whatever it is, right? So port server, which is a default port number, right? So these are the three major steps. Apart from that, there were four steps are required. Means if you want to add the next step, for example, you can write down, right? So add enabling configuration server in the application Java file is the next step. At the same time, if you want to run the configuration server, we need to click the right click on the project and running it as a Spring Boot app, all that. Next, if the server is running, right, so everything is fine, then whatever the configuration environment. So this part, there are few more steps which need to be discussed here. So these points which I'm going to discuss in the almost four steps were there. Four more steps were there. These four more steps that I'm going to discuss in the next class. Okay, right. So you please write down these points. Remaining four steps I'm going to discuss in the next session, right? So right from adding enabling configuration server in the application.java file, right? So these are the things that I'm going to discuss in the next session. Okay, so if you have any questions, please go ahead.